The good news of our Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. This Sunday is called Transfiguration Sunday in the church. It's the Sunday we see Jesus revealed before his disciples' eyes. And it's the last Sunday before Lent. The last Sunday where we glimpse God's glory before journeying with Jesus through the desert for 40 days, where we come face to face with what's in our hearts. And it is this Sunday where we're called to see how the glory of God, graciously revealed to our eyes, changes us. And it's good to have this sight before we begin the 40 days of Lent, because we're going to need it. For it helps us to remember that God's presence is always with us, even if it looks like it is hidden from our eyes, especially when we're in the desert. And so today, we're called to see what is there for us on the mountaintop, called to see the face of God, called to see the light of God clearly shining in our midst, called to hear all that God has to clearly tell us. For there are seasons when God gifts us with the gift of sight, the gift of being able to see, the gift of being able to understand, the gift of being able to see deeply, to see what's under the surface of things, to see what is hidden and out of plain sight, to see whatever it is that we are all called to see. Yet I don't think we're always gifted with sight, or that we're always called to see. We need to be made ready to see what we're called to see. For when we do see, it is the right time. Because sometimes it can be distracting to have too much sight. And it can take away from what it is that we're called to do with what is already in plain sight. And so when sight does come, when we are called by Jesus to have depth of understanding, it means that we're also called to have depth of purpose. When we're called to see, it's always for a reason. For this sight changes us deep within. This sight will cause us to live our lives differently. We'll be too changed by what we see to live our lives the same way we lived before. For what we're called to see is to see God more fully, to more fully understand that God is more present in our lives than we could have possibly ever imagined. And we are not to fear the clouds that come into our lives, the clouds that overwhelm us or cover us for days on end. God is in the cloud. The clouds are God's ways of drawing us in more closely, so that we are made ready to see what God has been waiting to show us and receive the gift of sight that will change our lives. I've had a recurring vision come to me in prayer of late. And it's one where I picture a fissure, a large crevice, a large crack between two large rocks is shown to me. And it's like a flat mountain that has been cracked open. The crack is wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. And as it narrows, the light is restricted and it's hard to see what is in the dark and the deep crack. And that gap between those two sides is really uncomfortable for me. And it represents an ache that I feel deeply within. And nothing seems to be able to fill that other than one thing: God. And so I've learned throughout the past weeks, as this image comes up for me time and time again in prayer, that sometimes the aches that we have within us are holy aches. They are aches to draw us near to God so that we may be filled by God. They are aches to remind us that above all, it is the presence of God that we especially need in this life. And a couple of weeks ago, there was a time when I was in prayer, and I saw water fill up the crack that is in between these great rocks. And as the water filled up the great gap in my life, I physically felt that deep ache disappear and felt better. But the gap wasn't something that went away for good, because the next time I was in prayer, that ache was still there, and there was no water to fill it. Instead, I felt called to sit on the edge of that mountain with my feet dangling in the gap and wait for God to come again. For I was called to see the deep crack in my life and in my person that could only be filled by God, and to trust in God's timing to fill it. In our gospel today, God comes to people on a mountain in bright light and in a cloud. And these are typical biblical references of experiencing God's presence, especially in the Exodus desert wanderings of the Israelites. And in our gospel, God also comes to people in a heard voice, which reminds us of Jesus' baptism, when God's voice proclaimed from heaven that Jesus is God's beloved Son and God is pleased with him. Whether it is on a mountaintop in shining light, in an overshadowing cloud, or in God's voice breaking through our lives, these experiences evoke trust in God's abiding and faithful presence to be with us when times are hard, to help change our thinking, and to teach us how to live in a newfound freedom. God's presence comes to change us within, to free us, to fill up our gaps. Because without the abiding presence of God's liberating grace, we are unable to change ourselves or to fill in the gaps on our own. Sometimes God calls us to meet upon the mountaintop, to spend time together, to see something important, and to hear what we need to hear from God's voice. Sometimes God calls us to meet within the aching clouds of our lives, just to press into the presence of God and to spend some time together. Sometimes God calls us to see shining light in order to be changed by it. Calls us to have our eyes open to see something especially revealed to us by the light of God. Something we really need to see so that our lives may be more complete. And for Moses, it was to receive those 10 teachings that would help establish healthy boundaries for Israel's walk with God and with humanity. And truly, these teachings continue to provide even our own generation, thousands of years later, with a moral compass and a way to honor the light of God that shines within us all. And in our gospel today, Jesus invites his disciples, Peter, James, and John, to journey with him upon a mountain and to see him shine with light. Jesus lets his friends see him and see who he truly is, and also his heavenly companions with him. And when God's voice calls out to them from a cloud, the disciples are told to listen, because Jesus is God's beloved Son, and he can be trusted no matter what comes their way. Hearing and seeing God transforms the disciples, and it even scares them. It almost seems more than they can really take. I think that's why Jesus touches them and calls them to get up and to not be afraid, and changes back into an appearance that doesn't scare them anymore. It doesn't remind them of how human they are. God will let us see only what we can really handle. And sometimes that includes seeing that gap within us, seeing our humanity, that reminds us that we're not God, so that we can understand what is truly of God and receive it, and how those gifts that are given to us in this life are enough to sustain us. Peter, James, and John were called to see the light of God in Jesus, to hear the love of God in Jesus, in the one who would lead them up both mountains and to the cross. For no one can go to the cross without seeing the light of God at the heart of it. No one can follow a radical path unless there is light seen shimmering upon the way. We need to be made ready for it. What is shown to us in our mountaintop experiences with God is a light to carry within us, to return down into the desert, into the challenging paths before us. They are there for us to live. That's where we spend the most of our lives. It is to serve as a lamp shining in a dark place, to be a morning star that rises within our hearts. It's to know that hidden behind the regular appearance of things is God. And when we're bowled over by what we see, when we're overcome by fear, when we're overwhelmed by the clouds in our lives, when what is before us shakes us to our core and we do not think we are nearly enough to be embraced by God's presence, Jesus will repeatedly come to us and touch us and say, get up. Don't be afraid. You are enough for God. Get up and do not be afraid. I've learned to not be afraid of that holy ache that is within me. To not be afraid of what can only be filled by God. To not be afraid of what God has to show me that will change me to live my life differently. And to live with greater trust in God's love for me even when I do not feel enough. To live with greater trust, surrendering to all that God reveals for all of us to see, and trusting that it's always the right time to see it. And although Jesus calls us to journey upon mountains and takes us through the desert and brings us through the valley and into the storm, Jesus lets us see him and lets us know that we're loved and that the grace that is given to us will be enough to change us deep within our core. It will be enough to give us a new sense of trust that God is with us no matter what we face. Even when we face those in-between spaces, those spaces in our lives that have wide gaps that need to be filled. And those places we don't really want to exist within us, those places that have yet to have resolution. Those gaps is where God's abiding and loving presence remains with us. We're enough to be. We're enough for God to be with us. We're enough for God's grace to sustain us. And when we're looking into those deep cracks and they feel really scary, we can remember Jesus telling us that it's safe to get up off the ground and to not be afraid. We can trust that Jesus is with us every step of the way. We are never too wounded, too imperfect, or too cracked for God to want to journey with us. We are never too broken to live. You are never too wounded, or too imperfect, or too cracked for God to want to journey with you. God is always with us and for us. And God's light visibly shines through the cracks within our persons that were made uniquely for God to fill. For as Leonard Cohen reminds us, those cracks are how the light gets in and shines through us.